We all ask the question, sooner or later, what good is history? Why spend time reading about people long dead and events long past when the present feels so urgent? In this episode, I promise to unpack why it's good and reveal history's secret sauce that will change your life if you let it. I'm Liam, a retired history professor. I love telling the stories of history. They're entertaining, but history is so much more than entertainment. So I am making videos about the value of history. You may want to check out my previous video in this series, which answers the question, what is history? So now that I have defined and described history, we need to turn to a qualitative question. What good is it? Is it necessary? What beneficial purpose does it serve? The historian John Tosh calls history a critical resource for the active citizen. He provides us with a distinctive way of thinking known as thinking with history. It means tracing changes from then to now. I like to describe it as seeing ourselves as part of the story. History doesn't only tell us what happened, it helps us understand where we stand in the story. But here's the catch. Our understanding of the past is always filtered through the present. Scholars refer to this as the living present. Someone in every generation reinterprets history in light of their own needs, values, and problems. This can make history feel relevant and alive, but it also carries a danger. If we're not careful, we fall into the trap of presentism. We commit this fallacy when we force the past to serve modern agendas. British historian Herbert Butterfield referred to this as Whig history. That is like saying, history is on our side. Presentism obscures our ability to know what happened and its context. History is at its best when it enriches public life. Accessible, relevant, and learned work can enhance debate and even inform public policy. Historical thinking shows us a broader context. It challenges the untrue stories that distort our perspectives. As a result, our decision-making is better informed. We can discard unfounded tales that make false claims. These unhistorical stories harm living individuals. They also disrespect the people of the past and even trivialize the undeniable evil forces of the past. An example is like comparing a politician we don't like to Hitler, or people who vote for him as fascists. By the way, do you even know what a fascist is? It's a term that history can help us to understand. However, many otherwise educated people use it without considering its historical context. Worse, its imprudent use lets the genuine fascists off the hook. David McCullough was one of our finest American historians. In his latest book, History Matters, published posthumously, he tells the following story. On a flight from Hawaii to San Francisco, I began chatting with a young woman sitting beside me. She told me she was a physician. She had attended a well-known university in the South and then went to a medical school. She was about 35 or 40, I would guess. When she asked me what I did, I told her I write history and biography. She said immediately that she had no interest in history. I asked, why not? Because you never know what's true and what isn't true, she said. I asked her what she meant. She said, well, you know, it all depends on who's writing it. I asked for an example. Well, World War II. I asked, you think maybe it didn't happen? No, not that. Then what? The Holocaust, she said. She said she did not believe it had happened. And she was not someone who had been denied education or books, or who lived in some remote part of the country and who knew nothing of the world. I'm old enough to have met people who were survivors of the Holocaust. One of my history professors was a gentle and gracious man who had survived the death camps. I admit I lack his or even David McCullough's for that matter, graciousness. I would lose my restraint with the young doctor on the plane. I have no patience with Holocaust deniers. Good history calls us to examine evidence, compare experiences, and act like detectives. Historical consciousness doesn't divide communities. It strengthens democratic life by opening space for honest conversation without denial. Let's start by considering what historical consciousness is. The real fruit of studying history is the development of historical consciousness. This skill involves being aware that history shapes our lives, thoughts, and societies. This is the best good that comes out of the study of history. But folks have to listen long enough to understand it. That's challenging to do in these times. My YouTube analytics indicate most people who view this video won't make it this far. So congratulations on making it to this point in my discussion. Our reward is that historical consciousness is the secret sauce of history. It can get us to sit down and have productive conversations. So let's unpack our reward. Historical consciousness dawns in our lives when we see that the past shapes the present. We then become aware of the danger of anachronism. That is, we no longer impose our developed views on the past. It is an epiphany to realize that people in the past thought in different ways than we do. They have stories and experiences that are totally unlike ours. And did you know, from the perspective of people in the past, things didn't have to turn out the way they did? How arrogant for us Johnny-come-latelys to assume that what happened was inevitable. In 1940, Churchill didn't know that Hitler would lose the war. Historical consciousness implies our own views will seem outdated to the next generation as well. And spoiler alert, we too will one day be forgotten. Sorry to break that news to you. But McCullough reminds us in a very real way that there is no such thing as the past. And that's an encouraging thought. No one ever lived in the past. They were living in the present, their present, much like we do. The historian John Lukacs sharpened the same idea that McCullough suggests. In the 1700s, humanity entered an era where history, not science, became our primary means of making sense of the world. We continue to live in a historical way. Don't confuse what McCullough and Lukacs are saying with presentism. Historians attempt to gather evidence necessary to understand the present of those who've gone before, not to force ours upon people of the past. Thus, to practice the discipline of history means we work at distanciation. We distance ourselves from our culture to understand theirs. It's like we walk a mile in their shoes. But for Lukacs, historical consciousness was more than professional scholarship. It touches culture, politics, and even daily life, both subjective and objective. The past is always remembered by human beings. And it has a moral dimension. It requires honesty and humility. To think in a historical way is to ask not only what happened, but also, how do we know? And what does this say about us today? One of the great virtues of historical consciousness is proportion. That is, keeping a balanced sense of scale. It means three things. First, we no longer see certain events while ignoring others. Second, as I mentioned earlier, we no longer judge the past solely by present standards. Finally, we don't allow today's headlines to overshadow the lessons of long-standing continuities. What I mean by the latter is long-term patterns, enduring problems, and recurring dynamics. Proportion keeps us sane when public debate loses its balance. Don't let the noise of today blind us to the deeper currents. We can say, yes, this crisis matters, but it is not unprecedented. We've seen similar things before. History shows us both warning signs and possible paths forward. It's about resisting historical amnesia. Headlines tell us what is urgent. Historical consciousness tells us what is essential. So, what good is history? Well, the simple answer is this: history is good for forming discerning citizens. They can gain their bearings in the present and make wiser decisions for the future. History teaches by example. It inspires tolerance, gives us courage. It's an aid to navigation in perilous times. But we should be clear, history doesn't provide us with neat lessons or final answers. Instead, it's an ongoing argument. Historians revise and always debate. Its aim is not certainty, but the reduction of untruths. History cultivates understanding and judgment much more than knowledge of facts. It enlarges wisdom by bringing us into dialogue with other minds. It also binds communities together through shared stories without coercion. It pays a debt to our ancestors by honoring their struggles and experiences. At its best, history is humane and literary. We see our world with new eyes. It makes us more human. So, what good is history? It won't solve all our problems, but it will help us see ourselves more clearly, live more humbly, and act more wisely. And in a time when misinformation and distortion run rampant, that may be one of the most essential goods of all. Let me close with another quote from David McCullough. I'm convinced that history encourages, as nothing else does, a sense of proportion about life, gives us a sense of the relative scale of our own brief time on earth and how valuable that is. We're living now in an era of momentous change, of huge transitions in all aspects of life, nationwide and worldwide. And this creates great pressures and tensions. But history shows that times of change are the times when we are most likely to learn. This nation was founded on change. We should embrace the possibilities in these exciting times and hold to a steady course because we have a sense of navigation, a sense of what we've been through in times past, and who we are. Thank you for taking the time to think with me today. Please like, comment, and subscribe.